the one of excess and the other of deficiency. Okay, two vices, a mean between two extremes. Okay, so if you imagine courage, here, let me write up here at the top of the board where you guys can see it. Virtue as a mean between extremes. If you imagine the virtue of courage, Aristotle says, practically speaking, what courage feels like, it is a mean between two extremes. On one side, we have rashness, and on the other side, we have cowardice. Okay, patience is a mean between two extremes. On one side, the deficiency might be sloth, and the excess might be haste. Self-control is a mean between two extremes. On one side, the deficiency, we might have asceticism. An ascetic is somebody who's unable to experience pleasure at all. And on the other side, we have indulgence. Now, the mean in all of these cases is not an absolute mean. It's not halfway through. It's not an arithmetic mean. So it's not halfway between the two extremes. Rather, it usually tends toward one side or the other. So, for instance, from your personal experience, speaking personally, would you say that when you have done courageous deeds, does the feeling of courage, does it feel more like cowardice or does it feel more like rashness? It's probably more like rashness, right? So it's more towards this side than it is toward that side. So the mean is actually not in the middle, it's toward this side. Okay, let's try self-control. We'll come back to patience. So self-control, when you have experienced self-control, practiced self-control, does it feel more like indulgence or does it feel more like asceticism? Asceticism, right? Yes? Yeah. Okay, and patience? More like haste or more like sloth? Probably more like sloth than it is like haste. Okay, so the mean is something that will be discerned by the person of practical wisdom. Practically speaking, the person of practical wisdom will be able to identify where the golden mean is a famous turn of the phrase, for where the golden mean is between the extremes, both of which are vices. For Aristotle, these behavioral characteristics at the extremes are themselves vices, but it is a virtue to find the mean between them. Okay. Now, that's the practical definition of a virtue. The theoretical definition, again, is that it is an excellence. I want to raise some objections against Aristotle's views, but I want, before I do that, to make sure we all are on the same page in terms of understanding his views on virtue, what virtue is, how it can be acquired, how it is stable, and what it feels like practically speaking. Are there any questions of clarification or comments about that? Okay. All righty. Let us then look at some objections. Aristotle says human character is something that is relatively stable. It's something that changes only slowly through numerous actions, a repetition of many, many actions, sometimes thousands of actions. And if you're in a state of virtue, good on you. If you're in a state of virtue, you can know that tomorrow or next week you will behave more or less virtuously. Okay, it's not as though you have to worry about, getting up tomorrow and doing some horrible deed, morally speaking, because virtue is stable, and if you have spent a lifetime cultivating it, then you can rest be sure tomorrow you'll probably act more or less the way you did today, and in a manner that is more or less virtuous if you embody a character state of virtue. But, woe to you if you're vicious, because vice doesn't change easily either. If you've been indulgent for a long time, then tomorrow you probably will be as well. Okay, if you've been cowardly for a long time, then tomorrow you probably will be as well. So it's a theory of very stable character states. But here's the objection, okay? The objection is the Milgram experiments. It's embodied in the Milgram experiments, and then I'll list a couple of other experiments. These were experiments done, the Milgram experiments were done were done in the 1960s by a dude named Stanley Milgram, who was a researcher at Yale University. Maybe you've heard about these experiments from your psychology classes. Okay, Milgram wanted to test Aristotle's theories. And so what he did is he put advertisements in the local newspaper. These were advertisements he was working with male subjects, advertisements for men of all different professions and socioeconomic conditions. He wanted blue collar, white collar, so plumbers, electricians, carpenters, investment bankers, lawyers. He wanted everybody. And they would set up appointments, and on the day of their appointment, they would come to his lab at Yale University. And they would walk in, and Milgram would be there in the lab. And there would be another dude in the lab, and this dude would be the ringer who was in on the experiment with Milgram. Okay, and the guys who responded to the local newspaper ad, they would be told that this was a study in learning. And their job was to try to help someone learn something. Okay, Milgram would give them a little bowl with 2 slips of paper, and one slip would be drawn by these guys, and it said teacher. Both slips actually said teacher. It was part of the ringer. The ringer would draw the other slip, and he'd say, oh, it says learner, I'll be the learner, that's my role. Okay, but the guys who responded to the newspaper ad were designated as the teacher in the experiment. Okay, and Milgram would sit them down in chairs, okay, in front of a window. And there would be a dashboard of various dials between them and the window. And on the other side of the window, the dude who was in on it with Milgram, the ringer, would be seated and connected up to a bunch of different electrodes. Okay, so these are like electrical connections. And the idea was that the person here, the teacher, would ask questions of the learner, and if the learner responded incorrectly, then the teacher, Milgram said, would deliver to the learner an electric shock. Okay, and so the experiment would begin. These are very famous experiments, some of the most famous in psychology. The experiment would begin, and these guys would be given a list of questions, and they would, from this list, ask questions of the learner, and the learner would respond incorrectly. And by the way, the learner was not actually hooked up to electrodes. It was fake, but these guys didn't know that. The learner would respond incorrectly, and Milgram would inform these guys, the teachers, that they needed to administer an electric shock, and so they would. And the learner would continue to respond to questions incorrectly, and Milgram would tell the teacher to increase the electric shock. Okay, and there would be a dial over here that would say, mild shock, moderate, strong, severe, deadly. Okay, and Milgram would tell them to increase the shock, and they would. And these guys would continue to respond incorrectly. Milgram, standing near the teacher, would tell them to increase the shock. And these guys would start to writhe from the electric shock. No real shocks taking place, but they'd start to writhe from the shock, and they'd start to act as though they were in great pain, and Milgram would tell them to increase the shock, and they would do it. From mild to moderate to strong to severe to deadly. So what percentage of the guys who responded to Milgram's newspaper ads what percentage of them do you think were willing to turn the dial all the way to deadly, watch these guys writhe in pain, see these guys fall over in the chair, and believe that they had killed the learner? What percentage do you think were willing to go that far? Evelyn? That's correct, yeah. Did you know that already? Yeah. Okay. Oh, you took a psych class, okay. Yeah, 66%, about 65 to 66%. 66% of people, or at least men, within 20 minutes of walking into Milgram's lab, walking in off the street into Milgram's lab, were willing to kill someone. That's an extraordinary result. That sent shockwaves through the psychological community. Okay, and I don't know if the result would have been any different with women. Milgram was trying to figure out how it was that ordinary Germans in World War II could become sadistic killers in concentration camps. And his conclusion was, well, if given the right environment, people very quickly can become horribly corrupted. Okay, and these guys would plant their face in their hands. They would break out in sweat. They would say, God, please stop it. And yet they would continue to turn the dial when informed to do so, told to do so by Milgram. Milgram's not shouting or anything. You can hear audio recordings of it online. He's speaking very calmly. He's saying, please increase the shock, or please administer a stronger dose, right? That sort of thing, okay? And these guys would kill other people. Now, is this a refutation of Aristotle? Because presumably, most of these guys, maybe almost all of them, have a pretty stable character state where that character is oriented toward respecting innocent human life, yes? I hope most of us have that kind of a character state, right? None of us, at least I hope you don't contemplate throughout your day, every day, killing people. Okay? When people do so, when ordinary, normal people do so, it's usually a fleeting thought that they quickly dismiss. Does this suggest that character, though, is not nearly as stable as Aristotle says? If people are actually willing to kill within 20 minutes of walking in off the street, in numbers like this, does that suggest that human character is much more malleable than Aristotle would have us believe? Does that suggest that Aristotle is wrong when he says that human character is a pretty stable thing? What do we think?
When they left, would they go and want to kill another person?
Good question. Great question. So there has been some controversy as a result of the Milgram experiments, because certain people coming out of that may have actually done sadistic things later on in life. Okay, I can't remember. I'm speaking off the cuff, off the top of my head, but the dude who became the Unabomber may have been one of Milgram's subjects. I'm not sure about that. I'd have to check. But definitely there have been cases of that coming out of. They don't do psych experiments like this anymore. It's like against the moral codes these days. But what do we think? Is this an indication that human character is very changeable and isn't as permanent as Aristotle thinks? There's another famous. While you're thinking on that, let me offer you one more famous experiment. The experiment was conducted by Darley and Batson about 30 years ago. And it was an experiment with young people, men mostly again, who were training to be preachers, pastors, preachers. young seminarians at Princeton Seminary. And the experiment was as follows. So they were told that they needed to deliver a sermon in the campus chapel on the Good Samaritan parable on a particular day at a particular time. Okay, and we're all familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan? Okay, the parable of the Good Samaritan is a parable that Jesus tells about a dude who happens upon another dude, and the other dude has been beaten and left by robbers by the side of the road. And the Samaritan who happens upon the dude who's been beaten, he wraps up his wounds, he takes him to a medical facility, he helps him with his own donkey, he gives him from his own material stores, okay. And so these guys were supposed to give a sermon on the Good Samaritan parable. And on the day of the sermon, 3 groups were divided up, okay, and they didn't know that they were divided up into these groups, right? But one group was people who were suddenly told that the time had been moved up to give the sermon, and they had 5 minutes to get across the campus and to go and deliver the sermon at the chapel, okay? And another group was told that the time had been moved up, and they had 30 minutes to get across campus and deliver a sermon at the chapel. Okay, and then there was a third group that had 2 hours, although they too had their time moved up. Okay, and on the way to the chapel, there would be a ringer who was bloodied and bruised, lying on the sidewalk. And the idea was to see what these guys would do. Of the people in the 5-minute group, what percentage do you think stopped to help the man who was bloodied and bruised on the sidewalk as they went to the chapel to deliver a sermon on the Good Samaritan parable? 0% stopped. In some cases, people walked over the body. They stepped over the body. I'm serious. 30 minutes is like 20%, and 2 hours is like 50% stopped. Okay. So obviously haste created, the circumstances created part of the vicious character in these guys. Okay, is this also a refutation of Aristotle? Is this an indication that Aristotle's theory of stable character does not work? I have a bunch more to say about this. We are out of time today. Let me leave you with this thought. I think actually Aristotle's stable character theory is correct. But I think that it is correct only within stable circumstances. If humans are left, or if they are placed in Milgram's lab or outside of their normal circumstances, then they are disoriented and not able to know what's right and what's wrong sometimes, and not able to act in accordance with their deep moral beliefs. Like when Milgram, an authority in a lab coat, tells them to kill someone. Okay, so I think what these experiments, speaking personally, I think what these experiments show is that people do not have stable character states when they are outside of their ordinary circumstances. Okay, but I think Aristotle's theory is right with regard to normal, everyday, ordinary circumstances. We tend to act the same way from day to day, and it takes a long time to change character in those circumstances. Okay, I'm a couple minutes over time. Thank you all.